If you did not get a book for the Deuteronomy class, there are like 2 left, which means I probably need to make more at some point so we have spares. But if you don't have a book, can I see your hand so I can get one to you? 1, 2, well.
How many do we need?
Well, we need 3, and I have 2. Did you forget your book? What? You didn't get one. There you, wow, now I feel really bad.
Who was it?
Joe in the back.
Do you want me to go make a copy of the pages? Do you want me to go make a copy of the
We
pages?
needed 3. Who else?
I will. I guess we're good.
Somebody else need a lecture.
I'll make more this week. I'll just do that. Don't worry about it now. But
Who was it that needed a book?
Sherry.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
Okay, we are in Deuteronomy chapter 1 this morning, and just for your reference, I have placed on the board what I believe to be the basic outline of the book. Now, there's a couple of different ways that people have chosen to outline Deuteronomy, but this one I think might be one of the more popular ones. The idea is that Deuteronomy is basically a covenant agreement or a treaty agreement between God and the nation of Israel. And most covenant agreements kind of follow the same pattern. They start out with this preamble, which explains what this agreement is, a historical prologue, which tells the whole history leading up to the formation of the agreement, and then we have the stipulations or the laws. These are the terms of the covenant that they're agreeing to. These are the rules you have to keep. And I've broken those up further into the general stipulations, which would include things like the 10 Commandments, the big stuff. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, things on which the whole law hangs. And then from chapters 12 through 26, we have some more specific laws. A lot more detail goes into that. And really, that's actually the longest section in the book to go over. And at the end of every covenant agreement, there was usually some kind of statement of blessings and curses. Sometimes it was just curses, but sometimes it's blessings and curses. And among the pagans, of course, what it would be would, if you do not keep the agreement, may the gods call these curses on you, etc. But in Deuteronomy, it's a little different because their agreement actually is with God. And so it would, instead of saying, calling on the gods to act, it's God saying, if you do not keep the agreement, this is what I'm going to do. And if you do keep the agreement, this is what I'm going to do for you. So there are blessings if you obey, and curses if you disobey. And finally, most of these covenants also included statements like witnesses, which among the pagans, the witnesses would typically be pagan gods. But since, again, there's only one God, and Deuteronomy affirms that over and over again, and God himself can't be a witness to his own covenant, what winds up happening is he calls heaven and earth to witness against them instead. There's also the Song of Witness. If you've ever heard of the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, it's explicitly stated that song would be a witness against the people when they fell away. There are also provisions for reading on a regular basis, and we looked at some of this last time, where every 7 years at the Feast of Tabernacles, the elders and the priests were supposed to stand up and they were supposed to read the law in its entirety to the people so that they would remember it, and they would remember what it said. So that's the basic outline of the book. This morning we're going to be focusing more on the preamble, on the historical prologue. I have really ambitious hopes to get through all of the historical prologue, but, well, you know me, so I'll just leave it at that. Let's start in chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan, in the wilderness, in the Arabah, opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Hazeroth and Dizahab. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the children of Israel, according to all that the Lord had commanded him to give them. After he had defeated Sihon the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and Edrei, across the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this law, saying... And then the rest is the speech that he gives. But what's the point of those first 5 verses? Why spend so much space and time devoted to describing this thing? This really long statement that introduces Moses' first speech. What's the point of it?
Well, anytime there's a very important event about to happen, what am I trying to say? You set it up. You give the you emphasize the importance of what you're about to say. It's kind of like a preacher is about to make an important point. You know, one older preacher who's now gone used to slap the Bible on his knee to emphasize it. And this is kind of, in a way, emphasizing what's about to happen is very important to you. And also, it gives us the place that this is happening. They're just about to cross the Jordan River to go into the land of Canaan, and they did not go in from underneath like they were going to before, but now they're going to go up and they're going to cross the Jordan River. They're in the southern Jordan area, but they're on the other side of the Jordan River now.
Right. And the main setting is right before Israel enters the Promised Land. Moses gives a series of speeches to them to basically prepare them for life without him in the Promised Land. And there's actually the first 5 books of the Bible, the Law of Moses, one always leads into the next. You get the ending of one book, and then the beginning of the next book always transition into each other. So if you back up to Numbers 36, verse 13, the very last book of Numbers, it ends Numbers by saying, "These are the commandments and the ordinances which the Lord commanded to the sons of Israel through Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan opposite Jericho." Then you start Deuteronomy and it says, okay, now here's a speech that Moses speaks to Israel in this same location, in the plains of Moab, across the Jordan. But it also gives some other information as well, you'll notice. What other information gets kind of crammed into these verses here?
Well, he talks about how many days' journey from Mount Seir.
Okay, why do you think he brings that up? 11 days' journey from Mount Seir. Where's Mount Seir, by the way, for reference? It's 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir. Where's Horeb? What is Mount Horeb?
That's Horeb by Seir.
Yeah, Horeb by Seir. Does anybody know what Mount Horeb is? Kind of an important mountain in Israel's history. Probably the most important mountain in Israel's history. Jenna?
Where the burning bush was?
It is where the burning bush was. Good. It is also where God gave the law to Israel. Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. Sometimes mountains have 2 names or 3 names or whatever. Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai are the same mountain. And this is going to become clear as you read throughout Deuteronomy. Because Moses goes on in verse 6 to say, "The Lord God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, 'You have stayed long enough at this mountain.'" He's describing where they were surrounding Mount Sinai. And he tells them, okay, you've been here long enough, time to go. And all the subsequent events that come with that. Horeb and Sinai are the same. And this is important to realize because Deuteronomy mentions the word Sinai one time in chapter 33 or something. And it's called Horeb for the rest of the book. So it's 11 days' journey from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea. Why does he bring that up?
Perhaps because they could have been in the land of Canaan 40 years minus 11 days ago. But
Just
they
about.
chose not to go in.
Just about.
It's taken them 40 years to make an 11-day journey.
Yeah, and that's the contrast between verses 2 and 3. It's 11 days' journey. In the 40th year, however, you're still in the wilderness. There's a problem here. And in reality, it actually took Israel 2 months to make the journey from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea. You read that by putting together Numbers 10, verse 11, Numbers 13, and verse 20. And probably because they're a large number and they're slow moving, but still, they could have been in there 40 years minus 2 months ago then. Nevertheless, here we are in the 40th year, still not in the Promised Land. 11 days versus 40 years is hinting at their failure. They could have been there, but they didn't make it. Now, the other thing that gets mentioned in this passage that's important is the defeat of Sihon and Og. And it already talked about that in Numbers 21, and we're going to look at that again in a minute. But it is a reminder of not only where they stand in terms of how long they've been in the wilderness, but also a reminder of one of their successes in the wilderness. That the defeat of Sihon and Og is going to be the first of many conquests to come. So those are the basic things. And 3 times in this preamble, it mentions the fact that Moses is speaking. Verse 1, these are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel. Verse 3, Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that the Lord had commanded him. Verse 5, Moses undertook to expound on this law, saying, why is that? Why repeat yourself on this point over and over? Because he was what?
Because he wouldn't be going in.
Okay.
So he was trying to impress upon them the importance of this.
Okay, good. Don, you have something?
Well, yeah, it seems after 40 years of wandering around in the wilderness, the reason that they were wandering around in the wilderness is because they didn't take God seriously. They ignored what he had to say. It's kind of like, okay, guys, I'm going to repeat myself and repeat myself and repeat myself.
Right.
Peter does that in his first or second letter. He says, I won't cease to remind you of these things. I'll keep reminding you. Here's a letter.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, people are really different now than they were then.
Right. And also on top of that, and these are all good points. One more thing I think that I would notice is that Moses' role in Israel, what was Moses' main role as far as God and Israel were concerned? Jenna?
He would speak for God.
He was the spokesman. He was the one that spoke for God. Now, Israel themselves requested this, and we're going to look at this some more in chapter 5 and chapter 9 and so on. But in chapter 18, whenever God institutes the what we would call the prophetic office, in Deuteronomy 18 in verses 15 through 22, it says that the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen, and you shall listen to him. And this is according to all that you asked of the Lord your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God. Let me not see this great fire anymore, or I will die. The Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. Now, God has already put his words in Moses' mouth, but there's another prophet coming that will also speak to them, and those words will be in his mouth too. In verse 19 it says that it shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And he goes on to talk about how you can tell the difference between the two. Now you get to the end of Deuteronomy, and there's one other statement that's really important to all of that. In Deuteronomy 34, in verses 10 through 12, describes Moses' death, and the last thing it says in the whole book is that since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord had knew face to face. For all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants and all his land, for all the mighty power, for all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. So there again you have this Deuteronomy 1:1. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel. But in Deuteronomy 34:12, since that time there hasn't been a prophet like Moses who did all this stuff in the sight of all Israel. Now, has there been a prophet since Deuteronomy was written that lives up to these descriptions here? Well, yes, there has. Yes, there has. And we talked about that last time. Jesus. Jesus is ultimately not just the prophet like Moses, but the prophet greater than Moses, who Deuteronomy speaks about. So that's what we're looking at in a nutshell here. And this is the emphasis of Moses speaking. Anything on the preamble before we move on? Gail.
Well, you were talking about the function of Moses between God and people, and just like the other prophets, and just like Jesus, he was, his function really went both ways. He was not just the spokesman for God, he was also the intercessor for the people, begging God's, in Moses' case, begging God's mercy for the people. Right. In Jesus' case, providing, a substitute for us.
Yes. And, on top of all that, of course, it says in Deuteronomy 34 that the unique thing about Moses was that he knew God face to face. It wasn't just and I mean, there were a lot of prophets in Israel that, God spoke to. You can think of Isaiah and Jeremiah and so on. But very few of them saw God face to face in the same way that Moses did. Very few of them lived up to the kind of ideal that Moses is described as doing here. Yeah, that's a good point. Deuteronomy, any questions before we move on?
Somebody might misunderstand what it says, but since that time there has not been a prophet, then we turn around and say, yes, there has been.
Well, yeah.
There's Christ. But I think we need to understand when this was written, and if that was written when we were in the book of Acts or something, Christ had come and so forth.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. Exactly how much time has elapsed since Moses died. Well, I mean, it seems clear from the end of Deuteronomy 34 that some time has elapsed since Moses died and that statement gets written. Maybe Joshua is the one that amends it to the end. Some people suggest that. I don't know. And there's no real statement that says one way or another. But it's evident that, whoever's hand touched the book last, there hadn't been a prophet since that time that was like Moses.
At the latest, it would have been Ezekiel, perhaps.
Ezekiel. Some have suggested even Ezra, but even
just throwing.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know. I mean, it could be anywhere in that mix at all. I mean, clearly Deuteronomy is in its final form by the time of Jesus, because Jesus is a prophet greater than Moses, and that seems to be the whole contention of the New Testament altogether. But Deuteronomy was pretty locked in place by that time for sure. Now, exactly what happens between then and now, I can't answer, and I can't say for certain. But there was a point at which somebody was looking at everything that Moses had said and done, and then through the inspiration of God, they write that there hasn't been a prophet like that since. That's a good point to bring out, Tom. Anything else? We got through the preamble fast. Only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sections left to go, and we'll be done with Deuteronomy. The other sections will take a lot longer. Beginning in verse 6, the Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. Turn and set your journey, and go to the hill country of the Amorites, and to all their neighbors in the Arabah, in the hill country, and in the lowland, and in the Negev, and by the seacoast, the land of the Canaanites, and Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. See, I have placed the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to them and their descendants after them. I spoke to you at that time, saying, I am not able to bear the burden of you alone. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are this day like the stars of heaven in number. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, increase you 1,000-fold more than you are, and bless you, just as He has promised you. How can I alone bear the load and burden of you and your strife? Choose wise and discerning and experienced men from among your tribes, and I will appoint them as your heads. You answered me and said, the thing which you have said to do is good. So I took the heads of your tribes, wise and experienced men, and appointed them heads over you, leaders of thousands and of hundreds and of fifties and of tens, and officers for your tribes. Then I charged your judges at that time, saying, hear the cases between your fellow countrymen, and judge righteously between a man and his fellow countrymen, or the alien who is with them. You shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not fear man, for the judgment is God's. The case that is too hard for you, you shall bring to me, and I will hear it. I commanded you at that time all the things that you should do. Then we set out from Horeb and went through all that great and terrible wilderness which you saw on the way to the hill country of the Amorites, just as the Lord our God had commanded us. When we came to Kadesh Barnea, I said to you, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is about to give us. See, the Lord our God has placed the land before you. Go up, take possession, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has spoken to you. Do not fear or be dismayed. I'll stop there for a second. Now, twice, what does God command the people to do? Go up and possess the land. Verses 6 through 8, verses 19 through 21. And you can note the parallels. Go to the hill country of the Amorites in verse 7. Verse 20, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites. Verse 8, see, I have placed the land before you. Verse 21, see, the Lord your God has placed the land before you. Verse 8, go in and possess the land. Verse 21, go up, take possession. Verse 8, as the Lord swore to your fathers. Verse 21, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has spoken to you. There is another thing I think is interesting, and it's very subtle, but it's the subtle shift between God, this is the God of your fathers, and this is your God. He says, I swore this to your fathers, I swore this to you. There's a continuity going on here, and we're going to see more of this as we go through Deuteronomy. But who was this covenant for that God made with Israel? Was it for one generation only? Was it for one localized group of people only? No. God has not changed, even though Israel is in a new generation. It's the same God and it's the same promise. And we live almost 3,500 years after Deuteronomy. Is Deuteronomy no longer relevant? Is there no further thing that this book has to say to us? Well, no. Even though we're living well after the fact, there's still a message here that God has for us as well. God's promises do not change, nor do His expectations for His people change. The things written beforehand were not written just for the sake of ancient Israel, but for our sake as well. In Romans 4 and verses 23 through 25, it was not for our sake that it was written that Abraham was justified by faith. But it was not for just their sake. I'm misquoting that. Quoted that backwards. Not for his sake only was it written that it was credited to him, but for our sake also, to whom it will be credited, as those who believe in Him, who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, He who was delivered over because of our transgressions and was raised because of our justification. Romans 15 in verse 4. Whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 11. When he's describing Israel's failures in the wilderness, he says, now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. There's a continuity there, like everything else. But in between these two commands for God telling Israel, go up, take the land, what's in the middle of that? And why is it important? Verses 9 through 18. What are these verses talking about? I heard two answers at once.
Too many people for Moses to judge, pick judges with the congregation.
Okay.
Help them make judgments.
All right. There's too many people, and you'll notice verses 9 through 18 are actually bookended by the phrase, at that time. I spoke to you at that time, verse 9. I commanded you at that time, verse 18. Because at the time they're leaving Horeb, Moses realizes that this people's getting too big. They're too unwieldy. Yes, Mark.
In reality, it was Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, that said to Moses, you're going to wear yourself out with all of this. You need to get some help.
Right, Exodus chapter 18.
But it's obvious from what Moses writes here that Jethro was speaking according to God's will for Moses to do. God was in agreement with what Jethro said.
There's two events in the rest of the law that this is connected to. One is what you're saying, Exodus 18, wherever Jethro tells Moses, you're going to wear yourself out if you're trying to judge these people. And the other one is shortly after they leave Mount Sinai, in Numbers chapter 11, the people say, we're sick of the manna, we want meat. We want quail to eat. And on that occasion, Moses complains to God and says, I've got too much to handle. These people are too numerous. And so in addition to sending quail from heaven for the people to eat, God tells Moses, appoint judges of Israel. Now, in terms of which one of those events is parallel, this appears to be a little more connected with Numbers 11. But understand, yes, Jethro brought up the idea first, but God approved of it, and clearly, he instructs Moses to do it at some point.
Jethro was a priest of God.
Yeah. Now, the main difference here even is in Numbers 11, appointing judges was God's command to Moses. And here Moses is requesting of the people, which it's not hard to see how that works. One text mentions one text mentions the other. That's not a contradiction. That's just we assume that, well, God told it to Moses, Moses told it to the people. And what is the issue? Well, the issue is that Moses can't bear the burden of the people alone. They're too big. Now, is that such a bad thing?
No, because he says, I hope God multiplies you 1,000 more times.
Yeah, and this is a good thing. He says, this is God keeping His promise. He's made you like the stars of the heaven. Just like He promised to Abraham in Genesis 15, verse 5. God told Abraham, go out, look at the stars. He says, you can't count those. That's what your descendants are going to be like. And now He says, Israel, God has made you like the stars of the heaven. And you know what? Verse 11? Let God do it 1,000 times more. This is a good thing. The problem is not, the fact that there's a big population. The problem is that in any group of any size, you're inevitably going to have problems. You're going to have conflicts. You're going to have strife that springs up as the result of such a group. And Moses says in verse 12, how can I alone bear the load and burden of you and your strife? And so what happens? People are told to pick men among them who are wise and experienced and who can act as judges. And in many ways, this is equivalent to the role that elders need to play in churches. There's a lot about judicial decision-making here, and there's going to be more about judicial decision-making later in Deuteronomy 16 and 17. And in fact, I would say that most of these specific stipulations in chapters 12 through 26 are largely, the judges are supposed to refer to that whenever they have to make a decision or settle a dispute between the people. What do? They go to the specific stipulations and they say, what does the law say? And how do we judge in this instance? How do we apply those principles to this person's situation? Now it goes on, verse 15, it says that these judges are heads over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Well, what's that talking about?
The different tribes. The different tribes. They were chosen from each tribe.
Okay, the judges were chosen from each tribe.
They were different sizes.
They were different sizes. Mark?
Well, it's very similar to our court system today. I mean, it was modeled after this. In Boy Scouts, in a Boy Scout troop, you've got the SPL and you've got the ASPL, the Assistant Senior Patrol Leader, and then you've got the patrol leaders, and then you've got assistant patrol leaders. And the patrol leaders are over their patrol, but when anything happens it's a little too much for them, they bring it up to the senior patrol leader who's over the whole troop. Well, we have the same thing, and we have county judges, we have then state judges, and then we have the Supreme Court. And so that's kind of the way this is lined out. You can't have one court, even a court, that's over all of the people. There are too many of them. You've got to spread these judges out among the people so that they can get to them.
Right.
And that's all this is.
There's one other piece of the whole thing that is important. In the history of Israel, what was it that we see judges doing a lot of the time? What do we see judges doing in the history of Israel?
Settling disputes.
The settling disputes, but what else? What's a big one?
Leading the people over their enemies.
Leading the people over their enemies. So the judges serve a military function in addition to a judicial one. And so, I mean, that may also be behind the idea of what we're talking about when it says leaders of thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. We may just be talking about military units is what we're doing. For whatever reason, Moses' charge to the judges, though, is clearly judicial. He says, what? Hear the cases, judge righteously between a man and his neighbor, or between a man and a foreigner, an alien. You're supposed to show partiality for one over the other? No. Do not show partiality, it says. Do not discriminate in who you will hear. Do not fear man, fear God. Because judgment belongs to God, and in the difficult cases they were to defer to Moses. Well, now they have a difficult situation arising where they can't defer to Moses for much longer because Moses is going to be taken away from them. And so it seems that Deuteronomy may well be intended to answer part of this question, or to at least give the law that Moses gave to the people so that they can refer to him in the bigger scheme of things. And keep in mind that Moses is making these statements to the people before the law is given in its entirety, before Deuteronomy is really codified for them. Moses has that information, but until it's written down, they have to consult Moses for that information to decide the difficult cases. So that's what we have there. And there's also a need for judicial integrity. Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verses 18 through 20 mention a little bit about this. He says, "You shall appoint for yourselves judges and officers in all your towns, which the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes. They shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice. You shall not be partial. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Justice, and only justice, you shall pursue, that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you." If the judges get corrupt and fail to do what it says here, they lose the land. They need righteous judgment among them in order to keep the land that God gives them. One other passage, Jehoshaphat appoints judges in a similar fashion in 2 Chronicles 19 in verses 5 through 11. It says that he appointed judges in the land in all the fortified cities of Judah, city by city. He said to the judges, "Consider what you're doing, for you do not judge for man, but for the Lord who is with you when you render judgment. Now then, let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Be very careful what you will do. For the Lord our God will have no part in unrighteousness or partiality or the taking of a bribe." In Jerusalem also, Jehoshaphat appointed some of the Levites and priests and some of the heads of the fathers' households of Israel for the judgment of the Lord, to judge disputes among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Then he charged them, saying, "Thus you shall do in the fear of the Lord, faithfully and wholeheartedly, whenever any dispute comes to you from your brethren who live in their cities, between blood and blood, between law and commandment, statutes and ordinances, you shall warn them, so that they may not be guilty before the Lord, and wrath may not come on you and your brethren. Thus you shall do, and you will not be guilty." 2 Chronicles 19. So that's basically what's expected of judges of Israel. All right, so any questions up through Deuteronomy 1:21? No? All right. Now, after the second charge to go up and possess the land, the next thing he tells them is, verse 22, "All of you approached me and said, 'Let us send men before us, that they may search out the land for us, and bring back to us word of the way by which we should go up, and the cities which we shall enter.' The thing pleased me, and I took 12 of your men, one man for each tribe. They turned and went up into the hill country, and came to the valley of Eshcol, and spied it out. Then they took some of the fruit of the land in their hands, and brought it down to us. And they brought us back a report, and said, 'It is a good land which the Lord our God is about to give us.' Yet you were not willing to go up, but rebelled against the commandment of the Lord your God, and you grumbled in your tents, and said, 'Because the Lord hates us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt, to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites, to destroy us. Where can we go up? Our brethren have made our hearts melt, saying, the people are bigger and taller than we. The cities are large and fortified to heaven. And besides, we saw the sons of the Anakim there.' Then I said to you, do not be shocked, nor fear them. The Lord your God, who goes before you, will himself fight on your behalf, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes, and in the wilderness, where you saw how the Lord your God carried you, just as a man carries his own son. And all the way which you have walked until you came to this place. But for all this you did not trust the Lord your God, who goes before you on your way to seek out a place for you to encamp in fire by night and cloud by day, to show you the way in which you should go. Then the Lord heard the sound of your words, and he was angry and took an oath, saying, not one of these men, this evil generation, shall see the good land which I swore to give your fathers, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh. He shall see it, and to him and to his sons I will give the land on which he has set foot, because he has followed the Lord fully. The Lord was angry with me also on your account, saying, not even you shall enter there. Joshua the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall enter there. Encourage him, for he will cause Israel to inherit it. Moreover, your little ones who you said would become prey, and your sons, who this day have no knowledge of good or evil, shall enter there, and I will give it to them, and they shall possess it. But as for you, turn around and set out for the wilderness by the way to the Red Sea. Then you said to me, we have sinned against the Lord. We will indeed go up and fight, just as the Lord our God commanded us. Every man of you girded on his weapons of war, and regarded it as easy to go up into the hill country. And the Lord said to me, say to them, do not go up or fight, for I am not among you. Otherwise you will be defeated before your enemies. So I spoke to you, but you would not listen. Instead you rebelled against the command of the Lord, and acted presumptuously, and went up into the hill country. The Amorites who lived in that hill country came out against you and chased you as bees do and crushed you from Seir to Hormah. Then you returned and wept before the Lord, but the Lord did not listen to your voice nor give ear to you. So you remained in Kadesh many days, the days that you spent there. Now that whole section is their first attempt to enter the land. And I guess the first question comes up, whose idea is it to send spies into Canaan? It's the people's idea, apparently. That's where it comes from in verses 22 to 25. Now, if you go back to Numbers 13, whose idea does it look like it is?
Looks like it's God's.
It looks like it's God's. And it's not that hard to resolve this. It's apparently the people request this, but God sanctions and approves of it. You know, there was nothing wrong with sending spies into the land to spy it out. So that's the basic idea here. And the spies come back and they report what? What kind of land is it?
Flowing with milk and honey.
It's flowing with milk and honey.
Everything that was promised.
It's a good land. It's everything that God said it was. And then the sad twist of irony between verses 25 and 26. It is a good land which the Lord our God is about to give us, yet you were not willing to go up, but rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. Sad irony.
Later prophet put it that there's a lion in the street. I can't go out there.
That's Proverbs something. Somewhere in Proverbs.
Yeah.
I want to say Proverbs 30, but I think that's wrong.
That's, there's giants in the land.
Yeah, there's giants in the land. We can't take it. And then what they complain, and the thing they say is pretty dramatic in verse 27. They say, it is because the Lord hates us that He has brought us out of the land of Egypt to deliver us into the Amorites to destroy us. Now, does God hate them? Well, Deuteronomy is going to say quite the opposite as we go through. In 4 verses 37 and 38, it says, because He loved your fathers, therefore He chose your descendants after them. He personally brought you from Egypt by His great power, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you to bring you in and give you their land for an inheritance as it is today. Deuteronomy 4 verses 37 and 38. Again, in chapter 7, in verses 6 through 8, it says that the Lord did not Verses 7 and 8, the Lord did not set His love on you nor choose you because you were more in number than any of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all the peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which He swore to your forefathers. The Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. God didn't hate them, He loves them. But the people did not love God. They did not trust God. For all this, they did not trust God. They're afraid of the Anakim. The Anakim were giants. They are the same thing as the Nephilim. We'll talk more about that next time because we're going to see a lot more giant words in chapter 2. And Moses pleads with the people in verses 29 through 33. He tries to persuade them. He appeals to their history. Look at how God defeated Egypt. Look at how God has fed us in the wilderness. God is capable of helping Israel. God is willing to help Israel. So what's wrong? For all this, you did not trust the Lord your God. Verse 32. He says in verse 31, God carried you like a man carries his son. Now, repeated throughout the law is this theme of Israel is God's son. Moses told Pharaoh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Exodus 4, verses 21 through 23. In Deuteronomy 14 and verse 1, it's going to say that you are the sons of the Lord your God. In Hosea 11:1, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And even though God carried Israel as a son, Israel was not obedient. This is, by the way, contrasted with Jesus, who is the true obedient son, as we see. For all this, the sad words of verse 32, you did not trust the Lord your God. They were unable to enter because of unbelief, even though God was visible to them the whole way. Mark.
And as Stephen put it in Acts chapter 7, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised heart and mind.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so God is angry with them, and He swears an oath, and He says they will not enter the promised land. As it says in Psalm 95 and verse 11, I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Even though God swore an oath to give the land to Abraham's descendants, God can also swear oaths to exclude specific descendants from that promise if they are unfaithful to Him. One oath is replaced by another because they were not faithful to the first one and they did not believe the first one. In verse 36, only Caleb is singled out as faithful. Caleb was the spy who recommended immediate attack in Numbers chapter 13. In verse 38, Joshua's name also comes up as the other faithful spy. But even in verse 37, Moses is singled out for judgment. And, when does Moses get singled out by God?
When Moses failed to give God the glory for bringing the water out of the rock.
Okay, Numbers chapter 20, which is almost 40 years removed from the events that are described here. And, the way, again, we reason through that, you're going to see this happen several times in Deuteronomy when Moses is telling the history of Israel. He doesn't always tell it in chronological order. Sometimes he'll skip around to an event that's related and say, God didn't even let me enter the promised land, is what he said. And you're going to see this in the golden calf story as well, too. The events are going to be in a different order than what we're used to reading in Exodus 32. And that's not because, we're conflicted with each other. It's because Deuteronomy wasn't meant to be chronological. It's meant to be more thematic. So here, the other question that comes up is whenever God says nobody's going to enter the promised land except Joshua and Caleb, did that implicitly include Moses? Did God know that Moses wasn't going to make it in the long run? And I don't have the exact answer to that. I think God probably knew. The event, and it seems as if they were implicitly included in the curses of Numbers 13 and 14. But then in the long run, Moses does do something that that shows that God will not, that he is not faithful and that God will not allow him to enter the promised land. And further irony is that the children that the parents said would become prey will instead become the conquerors. They were used as an excuse by their parents, but instead they become the sole heirs of God's promise. Just about out of time. I'll just cover the last paragraph briefly. The people try to take the land anyway. They say, oh, well, we have sinned. The only confession of sin in Deuteronomy, and it's not even that sincere. They're just upset because they don't get what they want. Their sorrow only comes after their consequence, suggesting where their real priorities lie. But God says, I will not go with you. Just as the presence of God was an assurance of victory, Moses said, God will go with you. He will help you. Well, the absence of God is just as much an assurance of defeat. His presence cannot be taken for granted. The Amorites show up. They crush them from Seir to Hormah. And the people weep in verse 45, but the Lord did not listen to your voice nor give ear to you. He did not listen to their prayers because they were sinful. Now this whole section demonstrates that Israel is prone to unfaithfulness. Next time in chapters 2 and 3 we'll look more at the more positive side of Israel's history leading up to Deuteronomy and hopefully have some other things to say about that. Tom, do you have something?
I had one comment.
Okay.
I read earlier the scriptures from Romans and Corinthians about these things were written for our instruction. I think we could definitely learn about the point you've just been making. Not to be too concerned about following a plan or wisdom. It's these things that are right there. Spies came up and said, we can't take the land. So I put a group fell into that thinking.
Yeah.
Because they said so. You got to be careful.
Exactly. No, and that's the constant thing throughout the Bible is the contrast between God's wisdom and man's wisdom, and God's way of doing things and man's way of doing things. We're going to close on that note, and we'll resume at 11 for worship. I went a little bit over that time.